Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Mary Ann Atwood, An Hermetic Mystery by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from Horizon, the Magazine of Useful and Intelligent Living, Volume 18, Number 1, Summer 1958. Mary Ann Atwood, An Hermetic Mystery by Manly P. Hall. In the library of the Society we have a frayed but sturdy copy of an exceedingly strange and curious book. Copies of the original edition of this work are practically unobtainable, and even reprints are extremely scarce. The full title of our volume is A Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery, with a dissertation on the more celebrated of the alchemical philosophers, being an attempt toward the recovery of the ancient experiment of nature. This is followed by a Latin quotation attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. At the bottom of the page we are informed that the publisher was Trelawney Saunders of Charing Cross, London, and the date of issue was 1850. There is no intimation as to the authorship of this profound treatise, but time, the discoverer of many things, revealed that it was from the pen of a certain Mary Ann South. To explore the contents of the Hermetic Mystery is to be profoundly impressed with both the extraordinary scholarship and the amazing scope of the production. The written form has been described as rather archaic and stilted, with the detached charm and literary mannerisms associated with the books of Mr. Thomas Taylor, the 19th century English Platonist. Neither the contents nor the presentation can be easily associated with a genteel young woman of the early Victorian era. Perhaps there is no other work obtainable which points out so clearly the philosophical implications of alchemy. In a private notebook, the authoress makes the simple statement, "Alchemy is philosophy." Obviously, the author-compiler of the Hermetic Mystery is a comparatively obscure person, for her name does not appear in the list of brilliant writers of 19th century England. Through the research of Walter Leslie Wilmshurst, who had access to the private papers of Mary Ann South, later Atwood, a fair picture of her nature and the motives which impelled her unusual undertaking has been preserved. Mary Ann South was born in Hampshire in 1817, the beloved daughter of Thomas South, who is recorded to have been a gentleman of leisure, a scholar, and a recluse. It was said that he was a man of certain means, an abstraction which seems to imply that he had sufficient money to assemble a rare and extensive library of classical works in many languages and dealing with philosophical and metaphysical subjects. We have books from the library of Thomas South in our own collection, including a beautifully hand-colored copy of Pandora, a compendium of alchemy by Dr. Michael Faustius, published in Leipzig in 1706. There are numerous plates touched with gold and silver, which set forth alchemical formulas by means of fantastic symbols. Due to the circumstances which will be explained later, the learning of Thomas South is comparatively unknown. The emblematic bookplate of Thomas South. Mary Ann grew up in the somber shadow of her father's library. Her interests were essentially the same as his, and she became his dedicated pupil. Later, she acted as his secretary, assisting him in the classification of his books and the continuous program of study that occupied his life. When she reached maturity, it is said that she became his intellectual comrade. The deepest subjects were fully discussed between them, and he came to depend extensively upon the amazing erudition of her mind. This is all the more remarkable because those who knew Mary Ann South found her a very simple and completely feminine person, shy and silent by nature and extremely devout in her religious instinct. The father-daughter companionship was never broken or marred, nor is there record of any other interests arising to weaken the bond. After Miss South had reached a condition of complete intellectual equality with her father, they decided upon an unusual literary undertaking. They resolved to prepare an independent summarization of their conclusions of the Hermetic philosophy. With the full cooperation of the household, they withdrew entirely from domestic relationships, the father establishing himself in one room, which served as his study, and the daughter in another, surrounded by the peculiar instruments of her own endeavors. Again, the psychological factors are unusual. Mr. South decided to prepare his work in the form of an epic poem, and Miss South decided to use the prose medium, with emphasis upon the scientific and philosophical aspects of alchemy. We do not know how long the two labored in their separate rooms, but it is recorded that it was for a considerable time. Miss South was the first to complete her work. So great was the father's confidence in his daughter's ability that he arranged for the immediate publication of her manuscript, without even reading the original or the proofs when they arrived from the printer. From the dating, it is evident that her strange book was published when Miss South was only 33 years old. This might not seem so remarkable today, but in the first half of the last century, the entire affair was a phenomenon of importance. Mr. South made arrangements with the House of Trelawney Saunders and paid all the costs incidental to the publication of the Hermetic Mystery. The only somewhat irregular circumstance noted up to this time was the failure of the authoress to place her name or any part thereof on the title page. If she had feared that the acceptance of the work would be endangered, had it been known that it was written by a young woman, she could always have signed it simply M.A. South. This slight circumstance later takes on considerable interest. Things were going well with the publisher, and nearly 100 copies of the book had been passed to libraries or sold to purchasers when Mr. South abruptly ordered the distribution of the book to be discontinued. More than this, he settled the question for all time by purchasing back all copies of the book for a sum of about £250, a considerable amount in those days. At first, thought one might suspect that he had finally read the manuscript or the completed book and objected to it in some way. This does not seem to have been the case, however, for the transaction was with the full consent and approval of his daughter. When the publisher had delivered all the books to Hampshire, they were stacked on the lawn of Mr. South's home, together with the entire manuscript of Mr. South's Hermetic poem, which was never completed and of which only about 12 lines have survived. A match was struck to the heap, and years of work disappeared in fire and smoke. Nor does the story end here, for through the years of her long and not particularly eventful life, the authoress carried on a continuous program of seeking out and purchasing back every copy of her book, which found its way onto the market from the original owners. She often paid as much as 10 guineas, $50, for a single copy. These books, in turn, have a peculiar history. For some reason, she kept a certain number and destroyed the rest. There's no way of knowing exactly how many of the original editions survived because they were in public institutions or otherwise beyond her reach. It is very likely that not more than 25 of the originals now exist, and some estimates are as low as 10 copies. Mr. Wilmshurst made an exhaustive investigation, and while he has several theories to explain the book-burning episode, it is quite possible that other factors contributed to the occurrence. First of all, surviving copies indicate that Miss South found a large number of typographical errors in the finished book, and was not entirely satisfied with certain of her quotations from other sources. This, however, would hardly justify the extreme methods she used. Second, both she and her father appear to have suffered certain qualms of conscience. They felt that they had exposed too openly a secret tradition which, if it came to be known by unscrupulous persons, might result in a serious disaster of some kind. Third, it appears that Mr. South and his daughter became involved at about this time in a current evangelical revival, for it is evident that they were highly religious and always lived close to the moral atmosphere of the Anglican Church. They may have felt or have been caused to feel that the Hermetic subject was a subtle kind of heresy and could lead to theological complications. We do not know enough of the South family to determine the possible degree of pressure that was exerted upon them by contemporary society. There are indications that they contemplated reorienting their Hermetic researches to bring them into line with Christian soterology. A fourth consideration should not be entirely overlooked. Miss South held the belief, and in this her father concurred, that the transmission of the deepest secrets of alchemy involved the use of hypnotism, or the inducing of mesmeristic trances. They may have changed their minds on this point, for apparently what they were really seeking was a discipline resembling yoga or a practical science of spiritual regeneration. Continued exploration of this field might well have brought them into conflict with the teachings of the Church of England. Again, many of the elements of the pattern are uncertain. Miss South repeatedly declared that the work should never be reprinted. On the other hand, she carefully corrected the copies which she preserved, and on some occasions intimated that the work might again see printed form. Her moods on the matter were not entirely consistent, which gravitates against the idea that her conscience had been deeply disturbed. There's always the possibility that totally unknown factors were responsible for the suppression of the book. Any hope that the Souths would either revise their previous labor or prepare a new work in the light of increased knowledge and understanding was frustrated by the death of Mr. South. He left to his daughter his wonderful library, but was unable to bestow the inspiration and courage which had always distinguished his labors. After her father's death, Miss South, as she herself reported, never recovered the dynamic quality of her scholarship. She declared that she required the friction of her father's active and creative nature to release her own thinking and fire her imagination and intuition. What might have proved to be a remarkable literary career developed no further, and she returned to the level of the quiet daughter of an English gentleman. In 1859, being about 42 years old, Mary Ann South married the Reverend Alban Thomas Atwood, a Yorkshire vicar, who appears to have been a cultured gentleman with a progressive mind and some interest in psychical research. Apparently, he had practically no knowledge of alchemy. In view of his profession, Mr. Atwood could not openly indulge in philosophical and religious controversies, but he read broadly and kept abreast with many fields of progress. From all that is known, the Atwoods were a contented, congenial couple. He was a benevolent man, well respected in the district, and his wife operated beautifully in the social phases of parish activities. No children graced the marriage, and Mr. Atwood died in 1883. There were probably very few who ever knew of his wife's adventure in the Hermetic arts. Mrs. Atwood lived in her deceased husband's home until her own death in 1910. She developed considerable interest in the early activities of the Theosophical Society and presented the greater part of her valuable collection of books to this society during the presidency of Mr. A.P. Sinnett. Portrait of Mary Ann Atwood in her elder years. It will be noted that Mrs. Atwood lived to be 92 years old, and Madame de Steiger has preserved an excellent description of her. Even in elder years, she was a beautiful old lady with great dignity and handsomeness of presence. She was naturally courteous and extremely modest and retiring. Yet, with it all, she retained to the end a superb intellect and an almost unfathomable profundity of knowledge. It was noted that she spoke hesitatingly, possibly due to many years of solitary existence. She would never open a conversation, but when the circumstances provided a proper opportunity, she revealed a rich memory, quoting from countless authors without reference to texts or notes. It is said that she had never been ill, and even at the time of her death, her hair had but slightly grayed. She seems to have died from no particular ailment, but simply from the fullness of years, and she was buried beside her husband, the beloved vicar. The book A Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery and Alchemy was reprinted in 1918 and again in 1920, both editions originating in Belfast. Almost immediately, further complications arose. It was broadly rumored through the literary grapevine that the reprints were heavily expurgated and that the deeper and perhaps troublesome secrets had been carefully eliminated. I have the original edition and a reprint before me, and careful comparison indicates that such a criticism is unfounded. Our copy of the first edition is one of those which Mrs. Atwood herself corrected and annotated. There is a note that she presented the book to a certain CCM on February 22, 1886. In the reissue, all changes from the original have been carefully marked. They consist principally of the correction of typographical errors and the improvement of translations. An occasional sentence has been added or deleted, but there is nothing to indicate that anything of value was actually removed. The reissue includes an elaborate introduction containing biographical information about Mrs. Atwood and, at the end, memorabilia. Also added is a portrait of Mrs. Atwood in advanced years and a reproduction of the bookplate of her father, Thomas South. The bookplate is obviously devised to emphasize Mr. South's interest in alchemical research. It features a serpent swallowing its own tail and surrounding an 8-pointed star. The motto is derived from Virgil. For practical purposes, therefore, the later editions may be accepted as authentic, the changes being such as Mrs. Atwood herself had indicated. The South Atwood Library has now been scattered, and books occasionally appear in the English and American markets. The case of Mary Ann Atwood presents many aspects which cannot be explained without recourse to a belief in the validity of the mystical philosophy of life. Although she gained much from her father, she was certainly born with strange aptitudes and retained them even though they were locked within herself. She wrote not in the spirit of the 19th century, but of those earlier times when alchemistical philosophy controlled the intellectual life of Europe. She has been called the last of the Hermetists, but also she was the intellectual heiress of the older Neoplatonists, Gnostics, and Transcendentalists. Like Emerson, she was born out of time, a citizen of a way of life that had vanished in limbo. She was certainly well acquainted with the works of Thomas Taylor, and of the moving spirits who sought to bring about a revival of essential learning during an age notable for its decadence. She had something of the spirit of Boehmer, who also found alchemy a useful instrument of mystical symbolism. She was aware of the researches of the American alchemist General Ethan Allen Hitchcock, but didn't regard him as having adequate mystical penetration. Some critics have said that Mrs. Atwood invented metaphysical alchemy, but this is certainly not true. Nearly all great authors and experimenters who flourished in the golden age of alchemy, 15th to 17th centuries, made constant reference to the spiritual art concealed beneath the symbols of chemistry. It has also been held against Mrs. Atwood that there are no records that she ever attempted practical alchemy. She had no laboratory, nor did she experiment with chemical compounds. Her book, however, tells why. To her, the great work of Hermetic philosophy was the restoration of the spiritual life of man. It is here that transmutation must take place. For each human being in search of truth must transform his own base elements into a kind of spiritual gold. This regeneration opens the way for illumination and mystical communion with God and nature. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.